is KBYP with all the radios off because of a storm. Disconnect for a storm. But I want to address a serious problem in amateur radio. The same problem that destroyed the CB radio service. And address the question of what is amateur radio. As sold for money in the present form by ARRL, that is not amateur radio. That's amateur CB radio. What is amateur radio, says the FCC, who are the authority, is that amateur radio is an engineering radio service. It is not a radio operator's radio service, period. I talked right in the mic, so we're sure to hear what I say. Not for radio operators. I don't care if the license form says operator. The commission and history say that amateur radio is for engineering, not button pushing and knob twiddling. I was licensed in the commercial world, second class phone in 1979. I left fingernail marks on the table. 300 questions. Not this softball, can you remember a couple of answers for a couple of hours? I had to do circuit calculations in front of an FCC examiner. And this was the exact book that I studied. This book. It's that thick. This isn't WXYZ's fake study and get a license test. This was real. And this is what amateur radio is actually more than this. The commercial service is for radio operators. Amateur radio is not. The history of amateur radio is that amateur radio became before commercial broadcast, before commercial anything. Amateur radio, more or less, was the original. And it was science and engineering based, trying to discover the principles of radio. When the commercial services came up, and this is outlined in the book 200 Meters and Down, the amateurs were actually ahead of the commercial operators. Now that's changed. And the FCC, with the complicity and making money from the ARRL, have gutted the amateur radio testing process and destroyed it. And it's simply a money-grabbing venture. The difference between amateur radio and every other radio service, except in some cases some of the military radio stuff, is that every other radio service is an operator's radio service. CB, police, fire, EMS, taxi cab, GMRS are all operators' services for communications. An operator operates radio equipment under some radio service in the US FCC with some kind of equipment, some kind of antenna, but they don't need to know much or anything about either of those. Those are for communication between point A and point B. Broadcast, a one-way communication between a licensed broadcast station and many receivers. No one needs to be technical on the receiving end. This book, this commercial license, used to be the required gateway to get into commercial broadcast or maritime or similar. If you think this Mickey Mouse ham radio test is tough, dig into that book. This book requires real knowledge. Analyze that circuit. I had to do things like that on that commercial test. Do circuit analysis, circuit design on paper in front of an examiner. See that? That's what radio is all about. And this is just a commercial book. Amateur radio is also about this. These are impedance calculations. Amateur radio is different in that it is defined by the FCC as an engineering radio service, not an operator service. The FCC says if it can be communicated some other way, use the other way. Amateur radio is not a telephone not to get on the air and talk about the weather or politics. We're to get on the air to test things we're designing, building, working with, getting on, testing antennas, tweaking antennas, testing again, restore some old radio. There's my baby. Restore some old radio. Significant technical challenge. Get on the air, try it out. Does it work? Amateur radio is not for communications. Communications by amateur radio is an exception, and mostly for communications where other means fail. Amateur radio is actually beyond and should even be more complex than the commercial world. This commercial manual is what operators in a broadcast service at least used to have to know to start up, operate, and maintain a commercially licensed radio station. These days, according to the people that are in that field, that's kind of disappeared. They tell me about people who have no idea what a transistor is. They buy computerized boxes made by some company and plug them in. There's a station, broadcast station. There's still people that specialize in designing and tuning antenna systems and putting all this together and making it work. Those are broadcast engineers. But amateur radio is actually beyond that. We're not communications, we're engineering. We should be in amateur radio to develop, research, study some advances in radio. And that's tough these days because most everything that can be discovered has been. But stick around and I'll show you an issued patent once I get around to filing it for an extremely neat piece of test equipment. As far as I know, it's never been done. And this is 150 years after the advent of the radio age. So there's still a little bit out there to discover and do, but that's what we're supposed to be doing. We do not study for a test. That's a scam. We do not study, memorize answers to questions after they give us the questions and then go take a test. Or it's Russian roulette to hopefully we learned and we can guess the answers to one of 4 or 5 different tests. And if we're lucky, it's the one we studied and we memorized the answers for a couple of days and we regurgitate the answers and check multiple boxes and get a license. That is not amateur radio. Amateur radio and commercial are studying principles of electricity, electronics, radio systems, and operating. Because radios in general don't operate themselves, we have to do it. To learn those principles and continue to learn. And the test is to see if we've retained that. It is not valid and not a valid test to go be baby birds and regurgitate answers on a test by guessing and checking boxes. Not only is the individual not learning anything that way, but amateur radio ends up being a hollow shell. You get real bored playing parks on the air, which is not amateur radio, it's a nuisance. It's accomplishing and doing nothing. It is not promoting amateur radio, and it just clogs up radio spectrum. Useless pursuit. That is almost purely operating, and that is not what amateur radio is about. And I'm saying that as a real extra class, a real commercial operator, GMRS license, and having started in this in the 1970s. This is Elmer, real Elmer, telling you this, not a fake Elmer. We've unfortunately got a new group of people who think they're Elmers because they got a license and they're good talkers. There was one on the air last week. God bless them, they don't know anything. It was much more difficult back in the 70s, before the internet, to do this, to learn about this. I literally had this book. This is the exact book I studied as a teenager. I studied it like the Bible, and I still didn't know a great deal. I passed the second class test with 75%. 3/4 of the class failed it. It was a hard test. And I got in coaching from a real engineer and a broadcast engineer, or I wouldn't have passed it. The amateur radio tests back then were similar. We did not study and memorize answers. We learned principles And in the back of the book, yes, sample questions and answers, category, maritime, elements of the test, all that. Yes, there are practice questions and answers, but they're not question and answers from the test. They are sections explain the direct and indirect methods of calculating operating power of broadcast stations. Give an example of each method. That's not a question and answer. That's a question with the theory and the math written out that we are to learn. And the answers are verified in the back of the book. That's what a practice test used to be. That's what it should be now. What we have now is an absolute disgrace. What we have now is what they did with the commercial driver's license testing process in the state of Ohio back in the 1980s. They completely gutted any knowledge. It was so bad, they gave out the answers to the test. I had a dispatcher for a company I was a friend with who helped me get the license, who gave me the answer sheet and told me how sad that was. Amateur radio has become the same thing. And we're not going nowhere. We're going backwards by leaps and bounds, especially with this digital nonsense, which is not radio. DMR is not radio. FT8 isn't either. That's amateur computer. And it is worse than just operating a box. It's going backwards because it's distracting attention from radio and focusing on amateur computer, which is no accomplishment whatsoever. So, especially with the prevalence of the internet, especially with sources like these companies online that sell books, get you a book. There's a height and breadth of electronics and engineering and radio there, and then 3 bookshelves downstairs, twice as big as that. A lot of sources on the internet universally ignore amateur radio information except for mine. If you see my video short, my information is based on PhD level text. I don't play with rookie stuff. I do it for real. But there is no end of good, credible, university-based, college-based information. And I'll go dark here to save a little bit of bandwidth. There's no shortage of credible college-level information online. I have a repository of 300 or 400 documents on my computers as to radio. Extremely credible stuff from real engineers, real scientists, real PhDs. Not the pablum that ARL publishes for profit, and that's all they're in it for. So use a computer, use your phone. Start by considering terms in radio, scientific principles. Go online, search this stuff out. Get books. Books are much better than computer. They're tactile, they're tangible. We can get our hands on them. We can mark them up. This is a real radio book. See that? There's a real radio book. Radio Engineer's Handbook. It's online for free. But this is the way to amateur radio. Not this flim-flam, I memorized a couple answers and got a license because, my friend, you're not a ham. And I'd really urge you to become one. It just takes study and learning. But just passing a test and pushing buttons is not amateur radio, it's CB radio. And you're missing a fascinating world. KBYP out.